Go. Okay. Good evening, and thanks all everyone for being here. I'm Maurizia Rebola. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of OGR. Thank you for coming. I do hope you stayed well in our spaces, in our community. And just a few words about OGR if you don't know exactly who and what we are. OGR Torino are a unique space for contemporary arts, for technological research, for innovation, and for entrepreneurship. You know, in OGR Tech, we have many companies that work with us. Born in the 19th century, OGR was a factory where trains were repaired. And then some years ago, about 10 years ago, Fondazione CRT, a bank foundation, decided to rebuild this space. This space was absolutely abandoned because at the end of 80s, the factory stopped their work and they abandoned the area completely. And the city didn't have the money to restore it, so the foundation took it and renewed the building to destinate it to two big areas. Here we are in OGR Tech, and the other area is called OGR Cult, the cultural space. OGR Cult was inaugurated in 2017, and we organize concerts, contemporary arts exhibitions, talks, kids activities, family activities, many cultural events. And here we are in OGR Tech. OGR Tech was inaugurated in June 2019, 2 years later. And in 3 years, we hosted more than 200 startups, more than 70 partners and companies. And actually, currently, we have 14 acceleration and innovation programs. What about your theme, your important theme, digital self-determination? Obviously, is a theme, central theme in OGR2, because we have many partners that can't work without take a look of this theme. And I'm not a technician, but I started to think about this theme, starting to think about the philosophical origin and the concept of self-determination related to a concept like dignity, autonomy, like freedom. I think Immanuel Kant was one of the most important philosophers in the world that started to think about self-determination. And freedom is a word, personally, I love this word. And personally, I love the humanity word too. And starting from these two words, I'm very happy to have you here. And I think we can ask today some of the most important people that can talk about digital self-determination. So thank you for being here. And now I can ask to you, Brigitte Benoit, for the Minister of Foreign Affairs, to take my place. And I leave to Brigitte. Thank you, Brigitte, for everyone, for everything. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you, because you are very great, really. And you can introduce the panel and the panelists. Thank you, Brigitte.
Thank you very much, Maurizia, for these remarks and also for your support. Buonasera. Good evening. My name is Brigitte Benoit-Landale. I speak on behalf of Ambassador Roger Dubach, who unfortunately had to leave Turin earlier today. I have the pleasure to represent him and the Swiss Federal Government of Foreign Affairs at tonight's event. First of all, I would like to thank the CRT Foundation, the ISI Foundation, OGR, but also the Politecnico di Torino and Nexa for the incredible hospitality. To be in this amazing space here and be surrounded by the local community who engages in digital themes and challenges is really, really inspiring. I also would like to welcome everybody here tonight who joined us physically on a nice evening, and everybody who joins us online to this important event, which we call Empowering Our Digital Journey, Unleashing the Potential of Digital Self-Determination. Before I pass on the floor to our partner, Stefan Verhulst, and the panelists, I would like to set the stage and just talk about digital self-determination. Switzerland has been developing this concept over the last few years in cooperation with national and international partners. And we have been conducting a number of use cases also, some of which you will be hearing about tonight. At the core of the concept of digital self-determination is the empowerment of people and entities in their digital lives. Such empowerment becomes more and more urgent as over recent years, digitalization and the power of data have fundamentally transformed the economy and the society. Within the digital world, data is the most valuable raw material. It is equivalent to power, and it holds enormous potential in various fields of our daily cultural, social, political, and economic lives. The way data is made available, accessed, exchanged, used, reused, constitutes the basis for a flourishing digital society and the economy for all. Yet, today people are primarily users, consuming an endless array of apps and digital services, whilst often being unable to control or enjoy the benefits of digital technologies and the growing datafication. In addition, a growing information and agency asymmetry can be witnessed in terms of who has data, who has access to data, and who controls the data. As a result, traditional governance models that have been designed for previous era are no longer fit for purpose, and innovative approaches are required. We therefore ask ourselves, how can we put the humans back in the driving seat? And how can we unleash the potential of that data holds for the economy and society as a whole? The concept of digital self-determination is based on the idea that the full potential of the digital society and economy can only be realized if people, companies, and society as a whole are confident that the use of data and digital technologies bring benefits and does not only result in the loss of personal rights, privacy, and also competitive advantages. Our vision is that people, companies, and society as a whole should be able to determine what actions they take in our digital world and act as co-creator of their digital environment. There are two components to the digital self-determination, an individual one and the collective one. The individual component means that data subjects have negotiated a level of control and access to the data they have generated and to data that is relevant for their decision making. The collective component promotes the participation in collective forms of data use. It benefits both the private and the public sector as they gain social permission to access new data resources and solve shared problems. To implement this concept, Switzerland has been pursuing the development of trustworthy data spaces, and we have been conducting, in cooperation with our international partners, a number of use cases to test this concept. And you will hear on the panel about some of these use cases. To sum it up and to use the wise words of Stefan, digital self-determination is not just about preventing the misuse of data, but it is also to address the misuses of data. And on that note, I have the great pleasure to give the floor to Stefan and our panelists. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Brigitte, for this wonderful introduction, and also for your leadership together with the team here from the Swiss government. I do have to say, I'm really impressed with how the Swiss government has pioneered in this space around digital self-determination. Quite often we discuss about data governance as if there are only three models. You have the US model, you have the European model, and then you have the China model. But I think what we hear today is that there are actually many other models in which we can innovate on how we go about providing access to data in a responsible way. And digital self-determination is one of those models that was already introduced by Brigitte. I had a 15-minute introduction to digital self-determination, but luckily Brigitte actually took this away and I can go straight into the panel. So if I could ask the panel to join me, as well as the respondents, please, if you could join here before I can introduce you so that people have a sense on who is who when I provide some background information. And so what we will do this evening is not just try to unpack the theory of digital self-determination, and thanks Maurizia for introducing Immanuel Kant, who is indeed one of the kind of inspirations behind the concept of self-determination. But what we hope to do today is to also make it tangible, make it concrete, and look into how do we actually go from theory into practice, and what does it mean to have digital self-determination within different use cases as it relates to different notions of self, different notions of determination, but also different notions of digital and how that ultimately plays out in different settings. And so, as I mentioned, we have an amazing panel, a few that came from far away and a few that are local that will provide wise words on what does it mean within the context of the work that they are doing here in Torino and worldwide as well. And so with that, let me quickly introduce. First, we have Bishakha Datta, who came all the way from Mumbai, where she is the executive director at Point of View. Then we have Claude Kamau, and I'm trying to practice, but I might have made already a mistake in how to pronounce you, who came all the way from Kenya, where he is a lecturer at the Strathmore University. Then we have Wengzi Zhang, who is at the Center for AI and Data Governance in Singapore, at the Singapore Management University. And then we have Elizabeth Sylvan from the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. And as I said, I'm delighted that we also have two respondents here, which is Ciro Catuto, who also was one of the, together with Juan Carlos de Martin, who also made feasible that we actually were here in Torino. And so Ciro Catuto is the scientific director of the ISI Foundation, but also a board member of CRT Foundation. And then Professor Juan Carlos de Martin is a full professor here of computer engineering, but also the vice rector for culture and communication and the co-director also of the Nexa Center for Internet and Society. So as you can see, pretty impressive panel. And so let's dive straight in and where we're going to look into how do we go from theory to practice as it relates to digital self-determination. And let me start with Bishakha. And yeah, if we could get the mic going. So Bishakha, you developed a studio in India, and tell us a little bit about what's the context of the studio. Why did you decide to have a studio on digital self-determination, and who would benefit from having more determination as it relates to data and digital? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Stefan, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel, as well as it's a pleasure to be in this wonderful space. I want to start by talking a little about India, which now is, I guess, the country with the world's biggest population, which is 1.4 billion. But the interesting thing is the population of mobile SIM cards in India is even bigger than 1.4 billion, right? And so that immediately helps us understand why digital self-determination is a critical concept, because we live so much of our lives in digital spaces. In that context, 15% of people in India have some disability. which already takes it to about, say, 200 million people. And I think what's interesting in the context of disability is that many people with, say, different kinds of disabilities, and there are 21 official disabilities in India, but many people who live with disabilities, whether it's, say, a visual impairment, or whether there's a mobility issue and someone's in a wheelchair, or if it's somebody with psychosocial disabilities or with chronic illness, a lot of people say that in physical spaces, they have to depend on others, right? And therefore, to some extent, their ability to determine themselves gets constrained in spaces where they must constantly depend on others. In this context, people with disabilities actually really think about digital spaces as spaces of freedom, as spaces where you can be yourself and enjoy perhaps a greater level of self-determination, because you don't have to really depend on somebody else. You can use technology yourself to sort of, for many purposes, to participate, express a whole bunch of things, financial purposes, etc. And I think the reason we were particularly interested and felt this concept was very relevant to this group of people is because when it comes to digital self-determination, it's an additional layer on top of self-determination. And it's an invisible layer almost, right? Because it's looking not just at your relationship with these spaces, but it's also looking at your relationship with the invisible actors in these spaces, which is kind of your data in a sense. And so we felt that given that this community already feels empowered in this space, that perhaps we could really explore what digital self-determination, what this concept really means for this group.
Great. Thanks so much. Yes. Thanks for the support here as well. Thanks so much, Vishaka. And so, Claude, over to you. So we heard from Vishaka about digital self-determination is a concept that can be applied in the concept of disability and in the concept of disability and digital. You worked on mobility banking within the context of Kenya. So tell us a little bit about the context in which you developed your studio.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you everyone for having us. So our studio, the Nairobi studio, looked at the phenomenon of mobile money data. So mobile money data in Kenya specifically became a disruptive technology in the mid-2010s, 2006, 2007, thereabout. And it's evolved in the sense that the service that you get on a mobile money platform transcends the mobile money service itself. So now mobile money services which are run on platforms created by telecommunications companies are tied to your GSM identity, and the nature of service you get on that platform traverses various areas of regulation or various areas of interaction with the market. So then you have mobile money services or mobile money platforms which also conduct banking services. You can borrow loans, access to credit, as well as communicate with other people in the network on the same platform. So then mobile money has become a very ubiquitous technology. Mobile money data has become extremely valuable in constructing models on credit scoring specifically. So the specific numbers, just to put this into context, are that Kenya is a country of 51 million people. We have around 35 million active phone owners, and nearly virtually every registered phone or every registered SIM card is also registered on a mobile money platform. So over the years, you have a generation of a plethora. Over the years, you have generation of a plethora of data that's tied to a particular person's spending choices, geolocation data, nature of purchases, and nature of transfers. You know, who are you sending money to, who are you receiving money from, and in what context. So specifically what has happened is that you have this increasing capacity to construct the fact patterns of individual people's lives just using their mobile money data. So then we thought it valuable, we thought it important to have a setting whereby we could investigate the nature in which participants in this ecosystem can express themselves in a meaningful way. We do know that there's been a slew of litigation around this. Data protection hasn't seemed to really help reinforce trust on the part of mobile money users. So it's actually turned out to be a very insightful use case. We have limitations that we've encountered, but these say nothing of the need to investigate the nature of the concept in this setting.
Great. Thanks so much, Claude. And yeah, super interesting. Super interesting indeed, because I think, anyway, there's a lot of exploration on how cell phone data can be used for a variety of purposes, right? Because to a large extent, we talk about the reuse of data. But of course, if you add an additional layer, not only of cell phone data, but also mobile banking data that is connected to cell phone data, then obviously it's a different order of actually potential, but also a different order of actually potential harm. And I think the use case clearly is of interest. So let's go to Wengxi. And so you worked on open finance. And so what do we mean by open finance, and why did you select open finance as a potential use case for digital self-determination?
Thank you very much, Stefan. And thank you very much, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to share on this very important topic. So open finance is basically a way of interaction between financial institutions and third-party providers, in which the financial institutions open up the access of consumers' data to these trusted third-party providers through a kind of mechanisms or technology called APIs with the consumer's consent, so as to produce the consumers with a broader range of services. So these services can include things like financial insurance, and also other financial derivative products. So as these open finance schemes kind of gain popularity around the world, as regulatory agendas in some jurisdictions, in fact, so there's a very heightened use of secondary data, which also brings along with it a lot of risks as well as opportunities for more responsible data use. So in this discourse of data governance in the space of open finance, there also lies many gaps, such as where is the place of the data subject in this discussion, and what should be their role in the more responsible management and use of their data. So this is where we found that it's a very important space for the exploration of what does digital self-determination mean in the space of open finance. And that's how we got into the use case. And in the use case discussions, we kind of invited a range of both industry leaders from banks and fintech firms, as well as regulators across Singapore and Switzerland, to kind of get a better sense of how the experts who are leading in the field think that digital self-determination can be implemented in the space of open finance.
Thanks so much, Wengxi. So we've had disability, mobility banking, open finance, Liz, education.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan, and thank you everyone for being here. So in education, in the days before COVID hit, there was, for many years, investment in online learning. And there was a great sense of promise for what that might realize. So there was a great sense of promise that learning analytics would really help teachers to understand what their students were doing, or, you know, perhaps testing could be built in a way to the learning experience that would really allow children to spend less time doing proving what they know, and just the system would just know what they know. And as the field progressed and more tools came out, learning scientists were saying, well, we're not seeing the findings that we think we want to be seeing, given the amount of emotional and financial investment that people have in these systems. And then COVID hit, and of course, everybody had this whole struggle in which they were adjusting in so many different ways, education being one. Here there was a test for the promise of online learning. Now, no one would have designed a test in this manner, so I think it really isn't fair to say that there isn't a still potential for learning analytics to realize everything that needs to be realized. But no teacher or parent would say to you, gosh, that was an entirely positive experience. Nothing ever went wrong. It was a very challenging experience for students, for teachers, and for families. And so we wanted to look at what are the ways in which data was being used productively. What are the ways in which students were digitally self-determined? What are the ways in which teachers were able to use data effectively, whether it was in a moment in a class, understanding the dynamics there, or over the long term, over the trajectory of a child's learning development, their social development, their engagement with topics. And, you know, we'll talk about the findings a little bit later, but in general, I think that you can predict some of the things that people found in the studies that were done of this time, that not everything that we had hoped for was realized. And so what we had hoped to do is look at exactly what were the dynamics there and how do they help us to understand the ways in which young people and students can be digitally self-determined in their educational world.
Great, thanks so much, Liz. And so, yeah, so these are the four kind of use cases that we will go deeper in today. Just for those who are not part of the network, we also had additional use cases as well, focused on migration and on tourism as well. And it shows, and I think that's actually the beauty of the concept of digital self-determination. It shows the variety of use cases that could be examined and also could benefit from digital self-determinations, especially as it relates to vulnerable populations that already are in a position where there is no determination of their space and in their lives, and where self-determination actually is extremely important. And so with that, go back to Bishakha. So what did we learn from your studio? You did 4 studios, to be precise. And so what were some of the key findings that you could share?
Yeah, we did 4 studios with people with disabilities and a range of technologists, researchers, academics, designers, so almost 100 people in total. And I think the first thing that we learned is that actually digital self-determination has to be negotiated by people with disabilities, because even though they experience freedom and independence online, there are many spaces that they cannot access. And 2 quick examples are, one is, many people experience the time provided to fill in one-time passwords online for banking or financial transactions as very limited if they have disabilities where the mobility of their fingers is hampered. That's one. I think the other very interesting case is actually on social media, where visually impaired people routinely say that if we have photographs or videos, etc., that don't have captioning, then it's not possible for them to really participate in social media, because in a sense the caption becomes like their eyes to be able to sort of visualize the image, right? So I think that's one real issue. And the big thing there is it's both behavioral, accessibility, as well as technical, right? There are certain features that are missing, but it's also sometimes feeling like that other people behave in a way where people with disabilities feel invisibilized. So I think, so it's something you negotiate on a day-to-day basis. I think the second interesting thing we learned was about identities that intersect. So say, for instance, a woman with a disability on social media is trying to figure out whether she should reveal her disability. And will that actually mean that people will accept her, or does that mean that people will exclude her? And this again is important in a context where people with disabilities are excluded online. And so you're negotiating like, okay, I'm a woman, I'm disabled, all these identities, how do I bring them together in digital spaces? And I think maybe just the third one that I'll touch on is sort of the canary in the coal mine kind of phenomenon, which is that there are so many people who are also what people with disabilities call temporarily disabled, right? So it might be that you might be in an accident and you may not be able to use your limbs for a while. As we age, we lose some of our abilities, etc. And so what we learned is that actually making the digital space more sort of self-determining for people with disabilities will actually make that space more self-determining for a much larger range of individuals across ages, etc.
Thanks so much, Bishaka, and super interesting to focus on the concept of negotiation, because I think that's also kind of unique about digital self-determination. It's not just like in the situation of consent where you choose between one yes or no. This is really about negotiation. What are the conditions under which you want to have access to the digital, or under what conditions data can be used, for instance, for providing services as well. So, Claude, over to you. What did you learn?
Thank you. So our findings traversed various themes, both in a regulatory sense, in a technological sense, and in terms of the socio-economic interaction between the average mobile money user and the state. So one of the things we saw was that there is some kind of unidirectional nature, and this is not necessarily common to mobile money data, unidirectional nature in which mobile money data flows, and it follows the path of power asymmetries. An important realization here was that the government is very much part of this dynamic, in the sense that we are looking at corporate actors who provide a platform, and it would be presumed that the nature of interests then would be of a corporate nature. But realizations such as the government holding a 35% stake in a market that's already monopolized. So it's a 35% stake in a company which has a 99% penetration in the market in terms of mobile money services, is something that could probably be problematic in terms of shaping incentives or towards moving in the DSD direction, in the self-determination direction, because then you have to wonder what the impact of the measures that have been taken up until this point are in terms of driving real change, if those measures can be equated with a governmental position, which is then being replicated at a corporate level. We then obviously looked at rebalancing, the nature in which technological solutions are applied in this sense. And at this level, we also saw there's a significant tension between the state and corporate actors in terms of onboarding technological solutions that could help us move towards the DSD direction. So specific concerns here that were raised by corporate actors were, for instance, the governmental stance on civic technologies, the sort of resistance to emerging technologies such as, well, not so emerging, but cloud computing, which is considered to be by these entities to be essential for cross-border data transfers, and some kind of agency on the part of corporates to share data. And you do know that responsible data sharing is an imperative of our framework at this point. And we also saw difficulties in terms of the relationship between the state and corporate actors on issues such as data localization, which obviously has implications on what we have seen to be the proprietary model underpinning data protection legislation. The other thing we realized was just the immense value of mobile money data counterbalanced against the comparative disempowerment of individuals or collectives that should be acting with some degree of agency when surrendering their data. So once you have a click on license or a pre-registration procedure, then there's very little involvement of that subject further down the chain. On these issues, we found that the culmination is that there is a response at a legislative level that may not necessarily be sufficient in terms of data protection as an overarching regime in achieving these outcomes. And that's very much the model which is driving the approach of these telecommunications companies. So over and above this, the problems of litigations that we have around this area form some kind of obstruction in terms of moving forward. But that doesn't mean there are no alternative avenues to pursue DSD, and we've mentioned a couple. We just don't have the time to outline all of them now.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Claude. And also interesting how you started off by focusing on how a dominant position could actually limiting notions of digital self-determination. And again, it goes back to this kind of asymmetry that exists in the space quite often, both an asymmetry between those that need data, those that have data, but also asymmetry from an agency perspective. And if you have a dominant kind of position, that might be constrained. So Wangxi, what did you learn through your studios?
Thank you very much. So I'll just quickly touch on 3 of the key takeaways that we got from the studio. So the first is that in thinking about the implementation of a principle like DSD, it is very important to look at what sort of motivations are there for organizations to kind of want to engage in more responsible data access and management practices that perhaps go a step further than to treat data subjects as pure recipients of the system and to rely on predominantly on check the box kind of consent exercises, which tend not to actually reflect meaningful engagement of the data subject in the entire data ecosystem. So as for the motivations to include the data subject more meaningfully throughout different stages of the data lifecycle, what our participants actually mentioned again and again is that it's very important to establish trust and consumer loyalty in that space, because this industry is very dependent on consumers' sort of endorsement, trust, and support for their legitimacy as well. So in terms of motivation, these have been identified, and there are also like reputational values attached to engaging in these data practices. So now it's down to how these benefits can be better communicated across the data ecosystems and to different stakeholders of the space in open finance. So the second point is on asymmetries, which has been mentioned a couple of times just now. So there are existing asymmetries both in the spaces of data subjects who might have a lower level of, say, digital literacy and financial literacy. And when all these factors compound together, the data subjects might not be able to navigate the space such as open finance as well as they have the potential to. And that has implications on some of the original objectives of pushing for open finance, which includes financial inclusion, because it brings access to a wider range of consumers who were originally perhaps left out of such options. And so to kind of realize the benefits of open finance, it's essential to also close in these gaps and dedicate some intentional efforts to empowering them in this space. And this also applies to some of the organizations that are involved. So for instance, in some of the emerging economies, one of our participants shared that about 80% of such an economy could be made up of SMEs, but a lot of these business owners actually don't have a fundamental understanding of some of the financial risks that are involved in this area, which are quite common to their Western counterparts, for instance. So in order to make responsible data management and digital self-determination a more implementable enterprise, these asymmetries have to be dedicated a conscious effort to closing. And the third reflection is also something that our participants shared during the studio, which is that digital self-determination as a discourse in the data governance landscape is actually quite, it has a lot of potential for feasible implementation because it is quite versatile and it doesn't conflict other existing regimes such as law, rights, sovereignty, but instead it can kind of complement these regimes in the respective locations of open finance and the implementation of it. So it focuses more on the positivities of data governance. So instead of focusing more on what should not be done, it paints a picture of how responsible data access can look like. So our participants kind of reflected that it is quite a hopeful discourse for the future, and they are very interested as well. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Wengzi. And again, super interesting to hear a different perspective around DSD. Quite often, and especially here in this community of startups and techs, quite often, anyway, going and engaging with users around determining under what conditions data is being accessed or being used, it's quite often seen as an extra cost, an extra burden. And then I think what you identified is that there is a business case, right, for providing digital self-determination because it adds to reputation. It also adds to actually responsible data governance. And I think another interesting insight. Liz, any insights from education?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the first insight was that the promise of learning analytics was not realized. I think it wasn't realized in two ways. One is very familiar to many people, which is that the experience was not great in the sort of COVID era, that there were many systems that didn't always work right. Not everyone has computers, not everyone has internet. Sometimes the internet doesn't work right. The teacher has to be on Zoom and the teacher also has to be doing this. And also the teacher has their own COVID era issues to manage. And, you know, so there was a lot of, again, not the best designed test case, but the reality of what everyone was experiencing. And then, so that's the you know, the what it felt like kind of take. But I think there was a second take, which is whether learning analytics did what people had hoped. And that really gets at more the data question. And it does certain things. It allows you to take tests in certain ways. And but one of the things that teachers said a lot was that, well, we have all this data and it looks like information, but there isn't synthesis and there isn't meaning. And, you know, so we feel responsible for putting all this information together. We feel like we should be doing a better job here. And, you know, coming from this externally, this, to me, the system was not built so for them to do that. And so they're taking the blame, putting it on themselves for an issue that was not only something that was not of their creation, but also something that was not something that they could fix themselves. That was a problem that needed to be fixed as a system. And that gets to the second issue, which is the incentive structures for the different stakeholders who oversee young people's learning are misaligned. So we spoke with ed tech providers, we spoke with teachers, we also spoke with school administrators and district administrators. And they all had a bit of a different motivation for what they hoped to do with data and how they hoped for it to realize something for themselves, for their organizations, and for the students. And because of the misalignment, an obvious misalignment is an ed tech company wants to sell stuff, and that includes data. But it also is alignments within the educational systems themselves, where the administrators are looking to kind of oversee or adopt the next great thing, and know what teacher is doing what, more than necessarily how is a kid developing from kindergarten, until they're 18, and what do they really want to become, and how does the system tell them that? And that isn't something that's happening even in the best systems. And then teachers, in some ways, they really want to realize what their students are and what they can be. They also need to get through the week, and there's 30 of those kids, and they have to test them on a bunch of different things and make them meet certain standards, and there's a lot of constraints they're working under. So their incentives are not aligned necessarily with their school administrators or with their district administrators. And what this means is that the stakeholders representing the children, they may have good intentions. They generally, the ones that I spoke with, absolutely did, but those intentions do not line up to realize learners' digital self-determination the way that we would want. And the final third thing that I would want to mention is that coming in with the philosophy of the principle of digital self-determination, we had some ideas of what we would imagine our stakeholders would want in education. And they would be things like using the data in the best way and making sure that the students' data is safe. And actually what we heard was a lot of pushback on that. And this is one of the things that surprised me personally, which was they were saying there's enough regulation. We don't want to get in any way of anything that would stifle innovation. We believe in learning analytics. We think it works. We're just not letting it work for us. And therefore, don't mess with anything that might get in the way of me being able to test my kids better.
Great, thanks so much, Liz. And again, super interesting insights also with the concept of incentives and the concept of, anyway, what are the interests and the different purposes that incentivize people or organizations to use or access data. And so we've heard about context, we've heard about what are the findings, and especially would like to go to the last round of questions before we go to the respondents, which is so what, right? So what do we do next, right? So what are some of the recommendations to make DSD or digital self-determination a reality within your specific context, but also in general? And so any lessons learned, and also specifically for the audience here that, as I said, might be more representing the tech community, and are there any kind of recommendations there that you says, look, if you want to apply DSD, these are some kind of ways to operationalize it, some ways to implement it, to make it a reality. And so, Vishaka, why don't we again start with you and then follow the same route, and then we go to Chiro and Juan Carlos to respond as well. Over to you, Vishaka.
Thanks. I think one of the recommendations that really came out strongly in the last two studios was the concept of universal design, right? And particularly for innovators, technologists, designers, that if you think of digital spaces as diverse, as spaces where there are diverse people with diverse needs, and you don't design or create tech only for a particular kind of persona or a particular kind of need, that is actually, I think, the biggest ask of sort of technologists, right? That if accessibility can be built in from the start, rather than come in as an afterthought, that these spaces can really be used by everybody. I think the other interesting thing around which can really deepen the discourse around digital self-determination in the context of data particularly, I think is as we think of people as data subjects, right? To really get a deeper sense of how do people conceptualize data. Is it something external like a resource like oil or something, etc.? Is it something that's internal, right? Like, is it because we put our likes, our opinions, our photos and videos? Is it something that's inherent to our personality or our sense of self? And the reason I think this is, again, something that's worth exploring in a larger context in terms of digital self-determination is because conceptually there is no real agreement on what data actually is, right? So there are many different positions. The feminist position is that your body is data. But how do people actually think about it? Right? In an earlier era, we used to ask people, how do you think of your phone? And some people would say, oh, I think of it as my friend. I think of it as an extension of my hand, etc. And that actually helped us think about interventions related to digital literacy. I think in a similar way, if we had a deeper understanding of how people actually think about data, which is amorphous, otherwise, it's invisible. Right? You know you're generating it, but you're not seeing it. It's intangible. I think it would really help us sort of build this relationship between data, data governance, and digital self-determination.
Great. Super interesting. Claude, any recommendations that emerged from your studio?
Sure. So just to pick up on what Bishaka has said about data literacy, we actually did realize that data illiteracy is a huge barrier towards people realizing what expectations they should have with regard to their encounter with the mobile money market. And going further into this, we sort of saw that there's a need for the structure of an operationalized DSD framework to be alive to and seek to respond to the multifaceted causes of such data illiteracy. So it's not a simple question of holding campaigns to teach people what their data is, or what data collection and data storage and use entails. There's also a conversation to be had about the value of the data itself. There's also a conversation to be had about the socioeconomic factors that contribute to data illiteracy, that make it that force the concept to take a backseat in the minds of data subjects, in the sense that it's not really a concern for them. The second thing that really came out in terms of maybe an approach that should be taken in view of what the stakeholder expectations are, was the need to iron out what the architecture or infrastructure of digital self-determination entails, because there were consistent references by corporate actors to the potential of the DSD architecture costing too much, right, or creating an infrastructural burden which still exists for the data protection regime. And again, obviously, the question of incentives. So a DSD framework has to respond to all of these questions. In metric terms, what does it mean to create DSD infrastructure? Is it as expensive as you think it is? Is it actually, there's no data practice is costless. Even data privacy, data protection is not costless. So the corporate actors also need to understand that there can be a commercial interest in entrenching these kinds of data spaces, because one thing that they do is, the quality of your data itself is improved. And of course, the reputational value then is enhanced, and reputational value has been a declared objective of the dominant player in this market, occupying 99% of the market share. But we've seen companies like that tumble because of a bad social reputation. And then finally, in terms of the distribution of centers of power, we've seen we've seen the limits of litigious statutory environment because the statutory environment on mobile money data in Kenya is very litigious because of the very strict oppositional rights-based approach that's been created in this space and the ballooning of the rights discourse in this area. So going by causes economics, it's possible for you to achieve meaningful outcome in the market following bargaining, effective bargaining between the consumer and the party on the other side, without necessarily having to focus on initial rights. So you can still reach an efficient bargain. So the bargaining language is something that's missing in data governance, and that's something that DSD can introduce in this market.
Great. Thanks so much, Claude. And yeah, super interesting. Also, again, it goes back to negotiation. Collective is DSD a form of collective bargaining that we don't have at the moment because of the way that it's too often focused on the individual, not on the collective also that can do this kind of bargaining. And also, anyway, both of you on, anyway, how can we have DSD by design, right? Both from the perspective of infrastructure, but also the perspective of, actually, how do we develop kind of a method to design DSD as such. Wengsi, any recommendations from your end?
Yeah, thank you. So 3 recommendations that arise from our studios. The first one is actually quite closely linked with what you shared just now about aligning incentives lists, and also on what Claude mentioned about having the cost in data management practices. So our participants kind of reflected that it's also quite essential to recognize the costs incurred in managing data in a way that's respectful and responsible, and kind of puts the data subjects at the center, because even in communicating different benefits and risks about the data will generate like a range of costs that's like including but not limited to human resources costs. So in that sense, the needs of the staff members who are behind these data management enterprises should also be recognized or compensated if possible. So the second recommendation is regarding collaboration, both on across public and private sectors, as well as across international borders. So this is really because there is a need to connect the dots between these different trusted spaces internationally, especially as different jurisdictions could have different levels of centralization in their financial systems. Some of them could have more fragmented landscapes than others. Some could go into more decentralized models than others. So connecting the dots between these spaces also can help to take some of the burden of data subjects in cases where, for instance, they want data portability, and the infrastructure should be readily available to them such that their needs can be taken care of. So connecting the dots through collaboration. And the third point is that there is some positive potential of exploring how to translate a principle such as DSD into practice on a technological level as well. So for instance, there are many mechanisms that talk about translating a principle that could be a bit more universal, although it has its core concepts, but there could be specific interpretations of it according to the recipient community's needs. So after it's interpreted locally and that it puts the subjects at the front and center of what it means for them, then there is some potential to code the principle in a way that machines or platforms in this case could understand. So perhaps that can come in the form of rules. So after it's coded in the computers, then the platforms could have some potential of better encompassing the needs by infrastructure, by design in that sense. But it's also notable to say that such practices are not all-encompassing, and some of the needs of the community participants cannot be captured by technological solutions like this. And so it's also very important to continue running conversations, negotiations, and keep up that communal involvement in the conversations of pathways towards DSD.
Great, thanks so much, Wangxi. And also very interesting, you dropped, of course, the whole concept of portability and data portability as well. And I think that's also, of course, anyway, in the broader conversation that we currently have worldwide, an area where we can connect DSD as well. And there's also connecting the dots, Alliance for Connecting the Dots. Liz, any recommendations from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the education studio, one of the things that really became quite clear was we need to think about what we want to do for people and what people want to do for themselves to be digitally self-determined. In the context of education, you know, we need to think about how to go from the constructs of learning or the constructs of engagement to the actual information or data that we have. And sometimes what happens is that the measurements become the test. So whatever you can measure, that's what you must want to know. That happens a lot in education, and I think it does happen elsewhere too. So I think really thinking about what is the bigger picture and what is the data or information that might get us there, and then how would we get that, and you know, in a way that's protective and respectful of the individuals who are contributing that data. And so that gets at actually the data portability piece that we were just talking about. And in the context of ed tech, there is often a lack of interoperability that is often by design, sometimes not, that I think is an element that would be something that we would want to be thinking about, because we do need data to be able to be put together in ways that really empower individuals. And I think for that, we need to have a model that protects people, but doesn't assume protection means you don't use anything at all. So that would be another piece that I think probably gets more towards policy and regulation. And how will we connect data in a way that's sensible to these bigger constructs? These constructs are hard. They haven't been realized after some work. And I think, you know, there's glimmers of hope in various places. And in order to realize them, I do think we need the data to be connected in ways that we want. And I think there needs to be figure out ways to align the incentives in such a way that collaborations can happen from the student to the teachers, to the administrators, to the ed tech providers. And I think there does need to be, in order for that to happen, the power imbalances that Stefan, you've been talking about, do need to be addressed, because there is a power imbalance. Both, I've been talking about ed tech, but also many countries also test their students. And so there's issues to address there as well. So I think thinking about how to build these, how to keep the bigger picture in mind, how to bring the actors to the table who can think about them well, and then how to have particular policy decisions that enable those conversations to take place and take action are all elements that I would hope that we would search for going forward.
Great, thanks so much, Liz, and thanks everyone for setting the stage here. And I think we've learned a lot in different contexts. And so let's go to the respondents who have the difficult task to respond to a very rich already conversation that we've heard, but also eager to learn whether DSD resonates in the work that you've been doing and to what extent that has manifested itself. And so let's start with Chiro, over to you.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks to you all for being here and for having me. Thank you to the DSD network at large and to Stefan in particular. It's impossible to answer and to respond, whatever that means, right, to such a broad set of challenges. So the only way I can tackle this is to sort of reflect on what those means in the context of my own experience. And so I'm going to bring you back to a traumatic experience, which is the experience of the beginning of the COVID crisis. The work I will be speaking about is really the work on using digital means to respond to COVID, in particular, the effort of designing digital contact tracing apps that emerged at the onset of the pandemic. And in March 2020, Italy was in lockdown already. That building over there, half of OGR, was a sub-intensive care unit. So there were beds. This place was completely empty. And so it was a very different world. And what were the challenges and the opportunities, right? Like at some point in mid-March, the team of Christoph Fraser came out with an idea. And the idea was that given the particular dynamics of COVID, there was a window of opportunity to intervene by using an app to map proximity relations and alert, as you know, people who have been exposed potentially to the virus. So this projected us into an opportunity that became instantly a problem, because in the meanwhile, COVID was pulling at the seams of our systems, no? Government, civil society, and big tech alike. And what I found very interesting is that digital contact tracing, forget about the specifics of digital contact tracing, but digital contact tracing lied at the intersection of these worlds. This was an opportunity to use the personal devices, the personal digital devices of citizens to carry out a public health intervention by using platforms, however, that are regulated by Apple and Google in that specific context. And so the complexity and the insights came out of this clash under emergency, okay? So what was the context? The context was that basically we already were having lockdowns. There was a massive pressure to get out of that somehow. And there was a lot of conflict in the public discourse. And these different subjects, no? Government, big tech, citizens, and civil society, they had different postures, different stances initially about this. The government, of course, saw a way to carry out an intervention, but there was also a lot of techno-solutionism on this. This was seen as a shortcut to deliver by digital means what was impossible to deliver at all, or certainly by traditional means, or by restructuring like non-digital processes. So it was also a way, you know, like to get away politically with you know, a way out politically that costed little, because there is this idea that digital is easy, right? And there was a lot of fragmentation. I know that for Italy, I was in the Italian National Response Task Force, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Innovation, and the regional health protection agencies, they had completely different stances and ideas about this. So it was like herding cats, even within the government. Civil society, you know, like there was, you know, the fear of the epidemic, and there was the opportunity to contribute to solving the problem by employing, you know, by volunteering a little bit of our data in a responsible way. But there was also a lot of undue pressure on citizens to trust blindly technology that they were not designing, and for which there was not a dialogue, right? And big tech also sort of has got a social license, no? Like just like governments in democracies, we entrust them with a social license to act in our interest whenever we share data with this platform and systems. They were fully aware of this. They were fully aware of the fact that code is low, and they were running the technical platform. And they were eager, no, to do virtue signaling, in a sense, to contributing to solving the problem in a way that's simple and preserves the trust of their users and the monetization capabilities of their platforms. So in a sense, you were mentioning about misaligned incentives, right? And this was exactly the same situation, where some of the incentives were serendipitously aligned in the same direction, not because of root like cultures or deep thinking. It just happened to be so. And others were wildly misaligned. And actually the most misaligned were really the government incentives in a way, right? So that's the context. So what we had to do back then was to design a contact tracing app that in this context could deliver on this opportunity. And I ended up being in the team, which was a Swiss team, by the way, led by Carmela Troncoso, as you know, at EPFL. And it's not a chance that this was a Swiss team. And because of that, actually, the idea of self-determination was ingrained in the design principles of this protocol. This was also supported by Swiss funding, by the way, because a lot of this work was supported by Botnar Fondation in Lausanne via a grant to EPFL, which is still running. So what were the design constraints at that point? The design constraints were basically to protect citizens, to break the false dichotomy of data protection and health protection, which many governments actually in the public communication pushed. Okay, this idea that you had to give up one thing to get the other, and so we wanted to deliver on both of these premises, empowering citizens. And the way we did this was to design a mechanism that would deliver only exposure notification without sharing this information with anybody else, without materializing nowhere a social graph of citizens, allowing citizens the maximum freedom to act on the information that the app was providing. So we really designed so that citizens could disable the app at will, that they could lie about having received the notification because the notification you received left no traces in the government's servers, without sharing any personal data. So GPS were forbidden, and this was enforced via actually the operating system controlled by Google and Apple. Citizens could decide to alert other people by basically clicking, sharing the exposure notification information or calling a government call center. But they could also decide not to do that, to use the information that they had been exposed and keep it to themselves. And they could decide not to alert their own contacts. And we designed for this. And all of this could not be monitored by whoever was running the system, nor Google, nor Apple, nor the governments, okay? Now, this was a technically sound design, and it was really designed with self-determination at the center. How was it delivered, however? It was delivered via Google and Apple, because eventually the use of this system was enforced by Google and Apple. And it was enforced and pushed over governments, many of which at the time were not very happy with this type of solution being chosen, because they saw it, in some cases very vocally, as an interference with their sovereignty, with delivering public health, with protecting citizens. And this created a series of, resonances and reflections and interesting results that we could write, and we will probably write books about. But for the sake of time, the end result of this was that basically there was no public communications that leveraged the social license of the governments in favor of using these apps, which resulted in a very low adoption of the apps pretty much everywhere. Wherever the app was uptaken well, Switzerland again is one of those cases, and London actually in the second iteration was the other. We know now for sure scientifically that it did save lives. So this was an opportunity that delivered when it was designed well, but it really had to be designed in a rush at the intersection of actors that have very different postures about the digital. And there was no time to properly involve in a consultation citizens, and we paid all the price for that, right? So I don't have much more to add to this. This is, I hope you appreciate just, like reading what you mentioned through one experience during a recent crisis that touched on all of our lives.
Great, super. Thanks so much, Ciro, for sharing this. And again, super interesting case study about DSD, but also, anyway, lessons learned that, it's important to have the principle, but it's also important to have the process for actually determining what that principle might mean and having then the communications around it. Juan Carlos, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful public meeting. And thank you also to the panelists and also to Ciro for what I heard. So I'm not part of this network. I'm sort of an outsider. I'm a computer engineer, and I will build, I think, along the lines of what the story that Ciro just mentioned. So my reaction is not really a response to the panelists, which I thank again. It's more thoughts that came to my mind while I was listening to them, and even more so after listening to Ciro, which is the following. Now, I'm a computer engineer, but I'm pretty fond of the history of technology. And when we talk about history of technology, actually we are automatically talking about something very fundamental, which is the history of industry and therefore on the history of economic development. And typically when we talk about economic development since the Industrial Revolution onwards, yes, people usually talk about technology, you know, the steam engine, etc., etc. But I want to push a little further, reacting to the specific title of this meeting, of this network, which is self-determination. Now, for about more than 200 years, for a country to enjoy self-determination, to cour, so broadly speaking, meant to be able to have a certain degree of technological self-determination. At least in some critical areas, some critical technologies. So not all technologies are equally critical in this regard, of course. So if you read, England, Britain at the beginning, so you have steam and iron and then steel, etc., etc. Then you have Belgium, and then you have France, and then Germany, Northern Italy, and so on and so forth. And if just as a total amateur dilettante, amateurish historian, but if you read about a little bit about what they did, actually they tried to secure all the stack, you would say now with a computer science language, saying, okay, we need to have the science, so we need to found the Polytechnic of Turin, which was founded in 1859. So you need the scientific knowledge, especially once you have chemistry and electricity. You cannot just tinker with it. You need scientific basis. So the modern technical universities are funded. So that's the scientific basis. But the scientific basis is absolutely not enough. This is necessary, but not sufficient condition. Then you need the actual raw materials. You need the production capability, etc., etc., all the stack. And actually, if you look at the history, at the time it was mostly an history of Europe, some European countries, then United States, then Japan, and then slowly other countries too. And it's a history of having if not the raw material at home, securing the way of finding raw materials in places you could control, like colonies. Then having the production facility, acquiring the know-how in whatever ways, etc., etc. And then, if you look at the history, you see that there were Italian companies, telephone companies, Italian energy companies, and French, and everything else. And that turned out to be normal for until very recent times. It was like a given. If you want to be an actual country enjoying a high level of freedom, not complete. In the world, very few countries actually had a complete or almost complete or very high level of freedom, but at least a decent level of freedom. You needed to do that. Now, let's come to our times. What strikes me is that in the last 30 years, talking about digital self-determination, European countries have decreased dramatically their digital self-determination on fundamental components of whatever digital determination means. I think I saw a French diplomat showing a comparison between Europe in 1990 and Europe 30 years later in some key areas in digital technologies. There was an obvious loss of ground by European countries. And so everything you know about this, I mean, we talk about the platform, the big tech companies, cloud computing, and many important chips, etc., etc. I mean, we still have, of course, a position in some areas. Is also an important position, but still, it's clear that we cannot say anymore that looking at these fundamental components of the digital world, that all European countries are digitally self-determined in this sense, not in the sense you were talking about. I'm talking about, the really hard components of digital power. Think about the device of our age, which is this device. The European presence in this device is very small. I think if you looking at the value of components, broadly speaking, I think it's less, maybe a few percents, like 2, 3, 4%. There are some MEMS produced by ST Microelectronics, maybe Bosch, not very much. It's truly surprising. I mean, this device is the device of our age, and Europe is almost non-existent. Not to mention the operating system and the major, there are a few exceptions. Some apps are European, but really not much. Now, we were talking about digital self-determination. Now I ask you, and I ask myself, and I wonder, can a country in the 21st century which doesn't have digital self-determination in this sense that I described actually is self-determined? Can be self-determined if you do not control this fundamental technology which is absolutely transversal and everywhere?
Ends on a question. Always good to have a conversation. Thanks, Juan Carlos, and super interesting to anyway add this additional layer of digital self-determination as anyway, which is quite often in, of course, a European context is approached as notions of digital sovereignty as well, right? But I think to add to your question, I think is that can citizens even demand a certain level of self-determination if a nation and a policy context has no capabilities to actually be self-determined themselves? And I think that's the additional question that I would add, is that it might actually be at different layers. If you don't, as a nation, if you're not be able to self-determine, can you then actually provide self-determination for different groups or for citizens as well? And again, it's an open question, which I'm sure a few in the audience might want to address. So let's open up. Any questions, any reactions, any violent disagreements, any violent agreements? And of course, I positioned it that way so to hope to get Mark excited to get going. So I'm going to give the mic to Mark as well.
Thanks very much, Stefan, and thank you for the two observations that came from the respondents. I was in Singapore during COVID, and we had a very different situation with surveillance apps, you most probably aware of, which certainly had no respect for self-determination at all. But I just wanted to move from the comment that you made, Juan Carlos, about whether you can have genuine digital self-determination if a nation state is not contributing effectively to the digital world in a technological sense. I'm wondering two things. Firstly, if we think about digital self-determination as a global question rather than an economic question or a jurisdictional question, but rather we all use mobile phones wherever they came from, whoever made them, whatever form they took, is the globalization of our dependency on technology and the use of data something which creates a new way of thinking about whether we determine our lives or not. So not so much being bound to the notion of whether it grows from where we live, but whether it comes from somewhere else and affects our lives. And the second point associated with that, connected to the concept of dependency, is just this idea that we create data, and social media platforms, many of the tech apps that we take for granted would really not be economically productive unless they had personal data to draw from. So I wonder whether the answer to digital self-determination also relies on the recognition of people in terms of the value of their data and how that data contributes to the development of technology and the development of digital dependency. So the global question and the question of whether we understand enough about our role as data producers and the impact that might have.
Great, thanks so much, Mark. And actually, to add to that last observation, is data actually the new stack? And if you, anyway, and this is an additional question from my point of view. If you cannot have a self-determination with the data, does that actually also make you, as a nation or as a community, less self-determined? And Vishaka has an answer to that.
No, I don't have an answer at all, but I would like to contribute to the discussion about national sovereignty in the context of the digital. And actually, I'm really thinking about undersea cables, right? Because all the infrastructure of the internet is under the sea. And currently there's some tension between the US and China. And there's also a choke point, I think, near Egypt, where so many cables from so many countries sort of cross through that it got cut at one point, etc. So I'm just wondering that can we, even in a context where our destinies are linked to each other across the world's geographies, because of these undersea cables, is it possible to even imagine digital sort of self-determination at a national level anymore, right? Like there's just so many layers, yeah.
And it touches also to globalization question that Mark referred. Anyone wants to respond? Juan Carlos as well, or yeah. Liz, why don't you start?
Well, just in terms of Juan Carlos's wonderful provocation, part of the I won't say answer, but anyway, thought that came to mind was this idea we've been talking about collective bargaining. And, we certainly see that the EU is engaged in collective bargaining against tech companies in a way. And so I think there may be answers in that, we look at the power structures and we see the ways in which we have power when we work together. And, some of that might come from legislation. Some of that might come from thinking about incentive structures. But I think that a country is not powerless, particularly when they join forces with other countries. And I would point to my Swiss colleagues here who are really investing in this idea of digital self-determination in hopes that it is a productive term and concept and a set of principles, not only for one place, but for multiple places in the world.
Great. Juan Carlos, you wanna, or Claude? Claude, you wanna add? Yeah.
All right, thanks. So very quickly. I think it's a very provocative thought, the role of the nation state and in this environment. But I come from perhaps a slightly more cynical view about the diminishing role of the state in these spaces. So at the same time, I do believe that as any other political value, democracy as a political value, now digital self-determination as political value. All political values, I think, require some material foundation for their realization. So historically, for democracy, it's been, relative economic redistribution. That said, I think the role of the state in guaranteeing the material conditions for people to express themselves in the technological reality is diminishing, obviously because of the power of global infotech, but also because of the nature of data itself as intangible, transboundary, the effects of globalization on labor, for instance. Many people in my country, Kenya, have left the formal workforce to participate in the digital workforce, working for overseas companies while from Kenya. At the same time, improving their material conditions and their awareness of how to participate meaningfully in the digital space. And at the same time, technology as a force entering our reality, I think, is also a force that co-produces that reality. So in many contexts, the reality that's being shaped by technology is that there are very few, inhibitions that a political entity can place on, individual agency, as aside from, erecting, say, for instance, existential barriers, banning internet access. But those are some of the extreme cases. But aside from that, I think the march towards, the reduced role of the state and, the capacity of the individual to create the material conditions that allow them to self-determine is a reality that you can't escape, and it's co-produced by technology itself.
Yes, I didn't want to get into the discussion about nation states, and also nation states are a specific form of territorial and organization that is historically determined and has been around for less than 400 years, and who knows about the future. But again, if we look at history of the last 200 years, we see a pattern where the rich countries would tell other countries, don't worry about developing technology. We'll provide it for you, just give us your raw material, okay? And in some cases, if you already had the technology, in some famous cases, they managed to weaken or destroy the local pre-existing basis of technology. And actually the rhetoric, even think about the great wave of decolonizations in the 50s and 60s was, this technology could be airplanes, or it's very complicated, you need an organization. I mean, it's difficult, somehow insinuating you're not really able to do that, but don't worry, we'll provide it for you, of course, assuming you're a friendly country, etc., etc. And there is a very famous speech by Enrico Mattei, who founded ENI in Italy against all odds after the Second World War. And actually, it's right before he got killed in '61. He's talking to people invited from decolonized countries, mostly in Africa, and he's telling them, they will tell you, like they used to tell us, that we Italians are only able to play the mandolin and to eat pizza, etc., etc. They would tell us that we're not capable of organization, of industrial development, etc. It's false. Italy at the time was having becoming a modern industrial country. It's false, and it's false also for you. So let's join forces and let's develop. So when I hear the discourse about globalization and the nation states is over, etc., it always comes to my mind that some nation states are never questioned. Some nation states, nobody questions them whatsoever. It's others nation states that, what do you want to do on your own? There are climate change and everything else. Nation states don't make any sense anymore. So then I always have a bit of a suspicion when I listen to this kind of rhetoric. I don't want, of course, on the other end, to worship the specific form of nation states. Also very clear, obviously, the consequences of nationalism and all the evil that produced. So I try to somehow to be in the middle of these two extremes, like let's dissolve, which means the other people should dissolve the nation states, and on the other hand, just to think that we should just put fences and just think on the basis of a nationality. Absolutely, that's not my case. I'm an internationalist if I have to say my position.
Great. Thanks so much, Juan. Carlos, any other question, any other reaction, any other perspective? I don't know whether we can have questions online as well, or whether there are any questions. Yeah, Chiro, any reaction from your end?
I do have a question for everybody, for the panelists in particular. we feel very comfortable speaking about these problems, and we share a language for speaking about these problems. Outside of this room, people will consider alien a lot of the discussions that we're having, even though they do impact the bodies and the lives of people. No, like data are blood and meat and flesh, like Alessandro Vespignani used to say when dealing with the pandemic. No, and so how do we do that? How do we get this conversation out in a way that that it can enter the public discourse? Because until we do that, and until we can recruit some of the political forces into, you know, having a posture about this, having a stance about some of these issues, I fear that the impact we are going to have is intellectually, powerful probably, but we do not control the waves that, you know, we are floating upon.
Important question, Shiro, Bishaka. This all relates with, I think, your, yeah. Bishaka was already fearing me. Somehow you were not looking at me anymore, Bishaka. I mean, but at least it sounds aligned with what you also mentioned on, anyway, how do people understand what data is? How do they define it? And also part of your work, right, at your organization is all about engaging in those conversations, right? So I don't know whether there's anything that you can share.
Okay, it's really the question of the moment, right? And I think we're all struggling with it. So the nonprofit that I work with, we use a variety of sort of communication methods to try and bring this abstract kind of concept and make it a little more relatable. So some of it is storytelling, you know, just different means like that. But I will say that it's very, very challenging. For instance, if you go to just an ordinary person who is, by ordinary, I mean who's not participating in these conversations in India, and you say, okay, what do you think of data? They'll say, yeah, I need, like, you know, every time I need to recharge my data, I have to pay 20 rupees. So that's what it's seen as, right? So now to change from that understanding to some sort of understanding of, you know, what is this intangible? It's very complicated, and we try these, but I think the only thing is in the last few years after the during the pandemic, etc., because the word is being used so much that more and more people are also trying to think of harms that they may experience, and people are talking much more about, like, oh, you know, this is something that's important to me, etc. So I think, yeah, but it's a unending struggle.
Yeah, and obviously, I think art has a role to play as well. So this wonderful exhibit currently here at OGR is actually a way to open up the conversation in new ways. And I think what is happening here is super interesting, and I think should happen more as well. But Wengsi, you have another solution.
So I wouldn't call it another solution, but reflections from two sides. One of it is actually something that I learned from your use case, Bishaka. So when you shared with us how you kind of pitched what is digital self-determination to a disabled population, you mentioned going from the concrete to the abstract. So often in academia, when we think about things, it might be kind of the other way around. But in speaking to an audience who is not necessarily well acquainted with this kind of language and this way of thinking, I think what Bishaka mentioned was very important as to how people can start to think about how it impacts them and like various aspects of their life when they feel free, they feel autonomous, they feel self-determined, even though people might not be very clear of whether all these experiences has the digital self-determination in its name. So in terms of communication, obviously other multimedia formats for outreach, such as videos, and also translating papers into different formats that's more digestible to specific needs of audiences, and also to take into account the accessibility needs as well. So all these different factors are important. And the other reflection is going back a bit to our experience in the use case with Open Finance, which is that when we tried to pitch what is digital self-determination to that specific crowd, what we found was that a lot of their understandings coming into the conversation was that they anchored their understanding on frameworks and existing regimes that they are more familiar with. So for instance, some of them mentioned the GDPR. So like, how does it match the GDPR's goals or not? And some mentioned, say, like the right to informational self-determination. So those are the things that they are more well acquainted with. So as a reference point, that can be how we enter the conversation. And from that point, it may be a little bit easier to communicate what we think is distinct, or how this digital self-determination is different from what they think it might be about, or how it fits into the existing discourses. So yeah, in that sense, it will be easier to align with objectives with this kind of predispositions in mind. Yeah.
Great. And so, Juan Carlos, you took the mic. I presume you want to say something. Go ahead. And I will give you the last word, and then we will close the session after that.
I will just very quickly try to answer Chiro's question, because it's something, he knows it, is something close to my heart, what I've been doing here at the Politecnico for the past 5 years, which is, I think that we should do everything we can. I work mostly in the area of culture and communication, try the most to explain to people that technology is not nature. So it's not given. It's not something that comes from outer space. It's produced by human forces. Human forces that can be traced down to specific entities, you know, first name, last name, specific entities. So it's completely explainable in a sense. Of course, the challenge of digital technology is that less obvious than a wristwatch or a glass. So it requires more, it is more difficult to understand. But we still have to explain that it is explainable. And it can be questioned, just like anything else produced by human beings can be questioned. And also, so the analytical part is, you should question that just like we question anything else in our, especially in our democracy. And the second part is that to activate a technological imagination, in the sense that I think that we engineers and everybody in the technical field have a specific social responsibility to enable a well-grounded technical imagination. So not science fiction, even though science fiction is a wonderful inspiration, but to say, okay, the smartphone or whatever else, whatever, everything you discussed is in a certain way, but it could be easily made in other way. You know, it's sometimes almost a no cost or even less cost in some cases. But in order to do that, you should, on the one hand, feel free and you're right to question the way it is right now, a certain technological device, and then to say, with the help of volunteers, engineers, saying, okay, but it could be like this other way, which address a certain specific areas of users or specific needs, etc.
Great. Well, I think this is a wonderful insight to close the session. Vishaka, Claude, Wengzi, Liz, Chiro, Juan Carlos, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom, and thanks to the audience for being here and for being certain. With that, I think we can go to what I think apparently many are aspiring, which is called, I think, aperitivo. Thanks so much.